Hello, my name is John Shaw. I am 70 years old. I must have listened to and watched maybe 50 or more videos put out by the White House boys. Okay, so they say they want to expose what happened in the Arthur G. Dozier Reform School in Marianna, Florida, so that no boy is ever abused like that again. Well, that's an impossible goal, but propaganda usually is somewhere topped off with some kind of ideological goal that is not really achievable. They also say they want to expose this information so that no boy will be harmed like that again. But you have to understand that in the Florida School for Boys at Okeechobee, the beatings going on there were far, far worse than what was happening in Marianna during the same period in 1965. I mean, if they want to expose abuse, how come they hardly ever mention that school? Well, I will mention it. The Florida School for Boys at Okeechobee is more than 400 miles away from the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys at Marianna. At the Okeechobee School, they had a building. They called it the Adjustment Unit. It was just a one-story building with a bunch of small rooms and wooden doors that locked. They had one room set aside for flogging, and they had flogging straps. Basically, I can tell you what happened in 1965, starting on September the 11th and ending on October the 21st in 1965 in the Adjustment Unit. How can I tell you? Well, I was there and I counted the number of lashes each boy got for 42 days. That's how I can tell you. There, the number of whacks usually started at 60. That's 60, not 16, 60. That doesn't mean everybody got 60 whacks, with absolutely no exceptions, but if a boy got 45, it was considered some kind of favoritism. Now, when you're beat like that on the buttocks, first of all, the skin turns black, and I mean black as coal, black as the ace of spades, jet black, and it whips off patches of skin, and it bruises all the way down into the muscles, all the way down to the bone. The pain is excruciating. I mean, try to imagine somebody pouring, let's say, a quart of boiling water over your buttocks 60 times. The pain was excruciating. It would go all the way up through the spine into the brain and cause a kind of semi-consciousness after a while. It caused pain in the brain. After it's finished, you would be partially blind. I mean, you could look around and all you would see is gray. You would have a hard time getting anywhere or going anywhere for a while. After that, they would throw you into a room. Now, in the room, you would have to lay on your stomach to keep the blood off the sheets and off the mattress. And if you laid there for too long, the blood would coagulate around the fabric of whatever it was you were wearing, and it would anchor the fabric into the wound in a kind of a crusty scab. So you had to be careful to keep that pulled away from the body, or if it coagulated around the fabric, you had to wet it with water repeatedly, or even go to an infirmary to get it removed from the wound or the wounds. This wasn't just paddling, this was sadistic paraphiliac torture. To give you another example of something that happened in the adjustment unit in those days, what they would do is sometimes these state pigs would go around in their vehicles and collect boys from the cottages or from school or from the work details and take them over to the adjustment unit to be flogged for whatever reasons they had for doing it. It could be something very simple like picking some rabbit tobacco out of the ground and smoking it inside of a rolled up piece of paper, or talking after lights out, or just saying that you wanted to go home and telling other people that you were planning on going home. All you had to do was say that. They called it talking about it. Okay, anyway, they had a bunch of boys. I don't know how many there were. They were lined up out in the hallway waiting their turn to go into this flogging room. Sometimes they made them sit on the terrazzo floor waiting their turn. Sometimes they just had to stand up and wait in line, whatever. Well, there was this one boy, and he heard what was going on inside the flogging room. He was just young, maybe 14 or 15, and he got scared out of his wits. And that's understandable because these beatings were very serious. I mean, that place sounded like a medieval torture chamber. So he stood on the side of a bed and he tried to throw himself off the bed and knock his head on the wall or on the terrazzo floor, either to kill himself or knock himself out. He was so frightened of what was going to happen to him when it was his turn. Well, he did it, but he was not successful in knocking himself out or killing himself. They saw what was happening. Now, you'd think that maybe they would have some compassion for him, some sympathy maybe, right? How about a little empathy? They didn't have to beat him. You know what they did? They fastened a football helmet over his head. They trussed him up in a straitjacket. They took him in there. They beat him to a bloody pulp and threw him bleeding into one of the rooms and locked the door. Then if he wanted to thrash around and knock his head against the wall, he had this football helmet on and he couldn't take it off. Nice bunch of people you have running the state there. As far as I'm concerned, those bastards should have been lined up and shot. That's one example. There were many things going on in the adjustment unit. Many people, many boys got beat severely. Not just one or two. It went on week after week after week for 6 weeks that I know of it. Now, there was one long series of beatings which went far, far, far beyond anything else that happened during the 42 days that I know of. And I'll tell you what it was, and this is beyond belief. I still can't believe it myself, and I counted the number of lashes he got every goddamn day. It was a black boy. I say a boy. He had a deep voice for a boy, but anyway, he was a male, and they took him in that room. And I'm going to tell you something now. They gave him over 200 lashes every day for weeks. Every day for weeks. 200 lashes every day for weeks. I'll tell you how it went. When they started with him, I think the first day it was something like 240. That's the one I remember best. About 240. When they started with him, he made these really extremely loud screaming and yelling, and these animal-like noises and begging and pleading for them to stop. I mean, he was yelling and screaming loud, loud, loud. And he went on like that for maybe 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 days. They beat him day after day. And they kept telling him to shut up, don't make any noise, don't say anything, and on and on. After so many days, he did stop saying things. He did not yell or scream, and he did not utter any words. He was probably unable to utter words. I'm sure he could not think or speak by that time. And it wasn't of his own volition. He was probably psychologically, cognitively, physically, emotionally unable to express himself in that way anymore. But he did make these really deep, guttural, grunting noises. I mean, they were really loud. You could hear it all the way down the hallway every day of his beatings. The only way I can think of to describe it was the sound that a bull alligator would make. If you've ever heard a bull alligator, it's like a really deep, guttural, grunting noise. It was something similar to that. And that went on for days and days and days and days and days and days and days, beating after beating after beating. And near the end, there was no noise out of him at all. There was no screaming, no words, no yelling, no pleading, no crying, no grunting, no nothing. There was only the sound of that leather strap slapping hard against dead meat. Did they kill him? I don't know. I did not see a dead body dragged out of there. It's hard to believe that he survived it. It's much easier to believe that he died from that than that he survived it. But you have to remember something. This was 1965. The racial climate in the United States was very different from the way it is now. In some parts of the country, for example, in the South, If a white man murdered a black man, it would be almost impossible to get a conviction against him with an all-white jury, and blacks were not allowed to serve on a jury, if you know what I mean. Or what about the two civil rights leaders, white guys who were murdered in Mississippi? They had an investigation. For some reason, they just couldn't figure out who killed them. Decades later, they found out who did it. It was the police themselves. No wonder they couldn't get an investigation going to find out who did it. They were asking the people who did it to investigate themselves. That's reminiscent of Stuart, Florida in the 1950s and 60s. I saw some pretty bad stuff going on in Stuart, Florida with my own eyes, but that's not what we're talking about right now. Okay, let me give you another example of something that happened on the campus, but not in the adjustment unit. There was this one kid I knew, I think he was 14, 15. His name was Patrick Timothy Gabriel. I had talked with him a few times. He seemed like a decent, clean-cut, honest guy, articulate. There was nothing that he said or did in any way that gave me the impression that there was anything wrong or bad about him at all. But somehow he turned up in the infirmary there, and he wanted to escape. Well, who the hell wouldn't want to escape? Who wants to hang around and be tortured for nothing? So he took off, and he encountered, they say, the head man of the school at that time, Mr. Salt. I think I heard Frank Zitch refer to Mr. Salt as the top man on the totem pole. So the story went, he stabbed Mr. Salt and ran away. Tim Gabriel was later found at a private residence near that school. He had been shot between the eyes, and I did see a black and white photo of his death scene. He was on his back on the floor inside a house. His arms were partially outstretched. There was a knife, maybe 6 inches from the fingertips of his right hand, and there was a bullet hole in his forehead above the bridge of the nose. Blood had trickled down his face to a pool under his head. Nice place, FSB Okeechobee. Lip. Now, there was another case of this kid I knew from West Palm Beach. He kept telling me these stories, and he gave me details about how this man had been molesting him in West Palm Beach. Now, this kid went into quite some detail. He did not fabricate this story. This stuff happened. The man who molested him owned a company called Butler Aviation in West Palm Beach. Butler Aviation was located on the property with the Palm Beach International Airport. Anyway, I got the impression that they had kind of railroaded that boy in there to keep him shut and protect that executive. Anyway, they beat this boy, and they beat him, okay, until he had seizures and went unconscious. His whole body would go stiff. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't talk. He couldn't answer. He could not respond. And he couldn't move, and he went unconscious. They beat him like that more than once. I'm telling you, there were some serious things going on there. There was also, I think it was 1 or 2 boys who were there, and some person had been sexually molesting them in their neighborhood. It wasn't a family member. And this person who had done that had been turned in. There was evidence against him, testimony, witnesses. But for some reason, they never arrested that son of a bitch. And then they took his child victims and sent them to Okeechobee and beat them to bloody pulp. What's that all about? I will say one thing for the government, though. Years later, the federal government did mount an undercover investigation in that same town, and they ousted that government. They got rid of those sons of bitches. They were found taking bribes. People didn't want to get arrested for what they did. They paid the police under the table to keep from being arrested. And other people knew about it, and eventually they got caught, and people went to jail. I think a county commissioner shot himself in the head. Later on, a former mayor was found shot dead. And people were arrested and prosecuted for taking bribes, and some deputy sheriffs went to prison, so on and so forth. A very small town. So these things were going on all the time. I mean, let me see. I was like maybe 14 or 15, and I had been at the Civic Center in my hometown of Stuart, Florida. I was simply walking home, minding my own business. A car pulls up, a guy gets out, he says, "Hello, who is it?" Well, it was the principal of a military school. Now, my father had sent me to a military school, I think to get me away from certain influences in the community, which was not a bad idea. I liked military school, but here was this principal. Now, this military school is like 70 miles away, so what's he doing here? Well, he was kind of stalking me, but I was kind of dumb and naive. I did not know that then. He asked me if I wanted to go see a baseball game. Of course, I felt very privileged and special. I mean, me? Wow. So I got in his Corvette Stingray and we went driving away. Well, it soon became obvious that baseball was not exactly what he had in mind. He started talking about matters dealing with sex. He told me some stories about some sexual activities he had with other boys. He told me graphic, lurid details about a live sex show he had seen in New York City, according to him. He stopped at a bookstore, got a pornographic book, brought it out, started reading from parts of it. He handed it to me and told me to read from it. I refused. He would reach over and grab me between the legs. When he did that, I would grab his arm and push him away. And later on, he drives by some municipal park, and there's a baseball game going over there. And he says, "Look, you cannot say I did not take you to see a baseball game," and he keeps right on going. Then he drives into the entrance of a Holiday Inn motel, and he wants me to go in there with him. After that, he went in to register. As soon as he was out of sight, I ran like hell away. I came to a restaurant. I didn't know what the hell to do. I just wanted to get away from him and go home. Well, I told some people what happened. They called the police. The police showed up. They went and questioned him. Of course, he denied everything. They came and questioned me, and they locked me up. Okay? They locked me in a cage in some place where they like to beat the shit out of little boys just for talking. Bunch of bastards. Well, I got out of there later on, and I was at my house in Stuart, Florida. And who shows up at our house of all people? This same principal of this military school with a friend of his. Apparently, some hearing had been scheduled for this case to be heard. I got locked up, but they still were willing to have a hearing on it. Well, this guy came by the house, and of course, he denied everything. I mean, he had to. Anybody in his place probably would have done the same thing. It was my word against his, and he knew that. As for the things he told me about having relations with other boys, he denied saying that at all. As for the book, the police did find the book in his car. He said I had the book when I got in the car. He said he never touched me at all. And he kept saying things like this. Why do you say this? What have I ever done to you? You know I've never done anything to you. You know I never said anything like that. I never did anything like that. Why are you saying that? I don't understand. You had that book when you got in the car. Don't you remember? Don't you remember? Okay, so the thing is, he had to play the role of the innocent person wrongfully accused. But in order to do that, he had to make me out to be a willful kind of sadistic liar or something. I hadn't lied about anything. I told the truth about everything. I did not want to get involved with the police. I just wanted to go home when I ran away. But I was too far away, and I did not know how to get home. Okay, so the thing is that he was allowed to go free, and the only one who really did any time on that was myself. I'm trying to tell you something about the state of Florida. It wasn't just the boys' schools. It was the state of Florida in general. If you want to read about the state of Florida, you could start with a book. It's called Finding Florida, The True History of the Sunshine State. Florida is a criminal enterprise, and it has been for a long time. It's just that the criminal enterprise part of it has gotten so bad, and people are so used to it that they have institutionalized it. What used to be like really illegal a long time ago is now just institutionalized and considered normal. So I've just told you a few things here. Many more things were going on in that Florida School for Boys at Okeechobee. And the beatings there were absolutely sadistic. They were evil. They were cruel. They were extreme. and the screams that those boys let out when they were getting 60 whacks, and sometimes 80 and 100 and 120, the screams that those boys let out was blood curdling. Believe me, it would turn your blood to ice water just listening to it. So when those White House boys come along and tell you how bad it was at the White House, that little white building in Mariana, remember something. It was a hell of a lot worse in Okeechobee. You just don't hear about it in Okeechobee that much because the Okeechobee boys did not organize. The Mariana boys did organize, and it's obvious they had some money and influence behind their organization to get all that much publicity and airtime and corporate media exposure, okay? That's why you hear about them so much and not so much about Okeechobee. There were many things going on, many more things than I just told you. I could sit here all night and tell you one blood-curdling, sadistic story after another. I'm not going to do that. You have the idea. And I would like to say one more thing. This is beyond belief, but I happen to know it's a fact. In 1997, I was teaching English as a foreign language at Yongjin University in Daegu, South Korea. I was also applying for a job through the email with the King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals in Saudi Arabia. During that time, I got detailed, and I do mean detailed, explicit information about the coming attacks of 9/11. From September of 1997 up to and through the night of September the 10th, 2001, I told maybe 120 people, and that means law enforcement too. Okay? Now, I could have done 100 times more than I did to get the word out. I knew what to do, how to do it, and where to do it, but I did not. I could have called the Pentagon 100 times if I had wanted to and tipped them off and warned them. The same with the World Trade Center. It was because of the abuses that happened in Florida, not only in Mariana, but also in Okeechobee, and other abuses far, 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 far worse. You could take all the horror stories from Mariana and all the horror stories from Okeechobee, and I was put through abuses, okay, far worse than that, all totaled, okay? That's why I made the minimal effort to get the word out. I mean, there's a saying, and it's been around for a long time. All terrorism can be traced back to child abuse. I don't know how true that is, but I know one thing. I was not about to turn around and go all out to protect the interests and the safety of a bunch of no-good, indifferent, sadistic, selfish bastards who would not do the same thing for me. Okay, what comes around goes around. Thank you for listening, if you did.